When we think of restaurants today, we picture carefully curated menus, individual tables, and waiters serving plated meals. But in medieval times, dining out was an entirely different experience. While the concept of a restaurant as we know it did not exist, there were still public places where people could buy and eat food. Taverns, inns, cookshops, and monastery guesthouses served as medieval equivalents, offering meals to travelers, townsfolk, and anyone who could afford them. Eating out in the Middle Ages was not just about food. It was a communal and sometimes chaotic experience. Meals were often shared at long wooden tables, and instead of ceramic plates, people ate from thick slices of bread called trenchers. Forks were rare, and etiquette was more about practicality than politeness. The quality of food varied greatly depending on location, social status, and the establishment itself. Some places served hearty, well-prepared meals, while others had barely edible, watered-down stews. To understand what eating at medieval restaurants looked like, it is necessary to explore the types of places where people dined, the meals they ate, the rules they followed, and even the conflicts that sometimes arose over food. These details reveal how public dining evolved over time and how it shaped the way people eat today. The concept of medieval restaurants. The idea of a modern restaurant, where diners sit at individual tables, order from a menu, and are served by waiters, did not exist in medieval Europe. However, this does not mean people never ate outside their homes. Instead of restaurants, medieval society relied on a variety of public dining spaces, including taverns, inns, alehouses, cookshops, and monastery guesthouses. These establishments served food and drink to travelers, townsfolk, and sometimes even the poor, but they functioned differently from the restaurants we know today. One of the closest medieval equivalents to a restaurant was the cookshop. These were small businesses where food was prepared and sold, often catering to people who lacked the means or time to cook at home. Customers typically bought ready-made meals, such as meat pies, roasted meats, or thick stews, and either ate them on the spot or took them elsewhere. Cookshops were particularly popular in cities and market towns, where workers and merchants needed quick, affordable meals. Taverns and inns also played a major role in medieval dining. Taverns primarily served alcoholic beverages like ale, beer, and wine, but they often provided meals as well. Food in taverns was usually simple: bread, cheese, and stews, but they were important gathering places where people socialized, conducted business, and even discussed politics. Inns, on the other hand, catered to travelers and provided more substantial meals, sometimes including multiple courses. Guests staying at an inn could expect a communal dining experience, with food served at the times rather than being made to order. Another important dining space was the monastery guesthouse. In medieval Europe, monasteries often provided food and shelter to travelers, pilgrims, and the needy. The meals were simple but nourishing, usually consisting of bread, vegetables, fish, and ale. Unlike taverns and cookshops, which operated for profit, monastery guesthouses provided food as a form of charity or hospitality. Public dining in medieval society was almost always communal. Unlike modern restaurants, where diners sit at separate tables, most meals in medieval inns, taverns, and guesthouses were eaten at long wooden tables, with strangers sitting together. Food was usually served in large shared dishes, and it was common for multiple people to eat from the same bowl or plate. Cutlery was limited, knives were used for cutting, spoons for soups and stews, but forks were rare until much later. Menus, as we know them today, did not exist. Instead, food availability depended on what the establishment had at the time. In a large inn, guests might be served multiple courses, including roasted meats, pottage, a type of thick soup, and bread. In a small tavern, the only option might be a single pot of stew or whatever the cook had prepared that day. Although medieval society did not have true restaurants, the existence of these public dining spaces shows that eating outside the home was a well-established practice, where people went to eat. In medieval times, people who wanted to eat outside their homes had several options, though none of them resembled modern restaurants. Dining establishments varied based on social class, location, and purpose. The most common places where people ate included cookshops, taverns, inns, alehouses, monastery guesthouses, and market stalls. Each of these places served a different function, catering to different types of customers and offering different kinds of food and service. Cookshops were one of the most accessible places for people to buy prepared food, especially in cities and towns. These small businesses sold hot meals to workers, travelers, and townspeople who either could not cook at home or needed a quick and affordable meal. Customers typically did not sit and eat inside the cook shop. Instead, they would take their food to go or eat at nearby benches and public spaces. Common meals included roasted meats, pies, pottage, which was a thick stew, and bread. Cookshops were especially useful for the working class, who often lacked the facilities to cook proper meals in their homes. Taverns, while primarily drinking establishments, also served food, making them popular spots for casual dining and socializing. They catered mainly to merchants, travelers, and townsfolk, offering simple meals like bread, cheese, and stews to accompany ale or wine. Taverns were lively and sometimes rowdy places where people gathered to discuss business, politics, or local gossip. Unlike cookshops, where food was bought and taken elsewhere, taverns provided a space to sit and eat, often in a communal setting. Inns were larger and more structured than taverns, designed primarily for travelers needing food and lodging. Meals at inns were typically more substantial than those at cookshops or taverns, sometimes including multiple courses. However, dining was communal, with guests eating at large wooden tables and sharing food with strangers. Unlike modern hotels, where guests can order meals whenever they wish, inns had set meal times and everyone ate what was prepared. Inns often served roasted meats, fish, vegetables, and bread, depending on the region and what was in season. Alehouses were smaller and more rustic than taverns, catering mainly to the lower classes. They focused on serving ale and beer, but some also offered basic food, such as pottage or bread and cheese. Unlike taverns, which attracted wealthier patrons, alehouses were informal gathering spots for laborers and peasants. The food was not the main attraction. Most people came to drink, relax, and engage in conversation. For travelers and the poor, monasteries provided a charitable alternative to inns and taverns. Many monasteries had guest houses where they offered food and shelter, following the Christian tradition of hospitality. The meals were simple but filling, often consisting of bread, vegetables, fish, and ale. Unlike taverns and inns, where customers had to pay, monastery meals were often free or provided in exchange for work or prayer. For those who wanted something quick and inexpensive, market stalls and street vendors were common sources of food. Vendors sold items like meat pies, roasted nuts, and fried fish, catering to both locals and visitors. These stalls were especially popular during fairs and festivals, where a variety of food options were available. Unlike inns and taverns, where dining was a social event, market stalls offered a fast and convenient way to eat while on the go. Medieval people had many options for eating out, even if they did not resemble modern restaurants. Whether it was a quick meal from a cookshop, a communal feast at an inn, or a simple stew at a tavern, these establishments provided both food and social interaction. Who ate out? Eating out in medieval times was not a common luxury, but rather a necessity for specific groups of people. Unlike today, where dining out is often about convenience or leisure, medieval public dining was dictated by occupation, social class, and lifestyle. Those who regularly ate outside their homes included travelers, merchants, laborers, soldiers, clergy, and the wealthy elite, each with their own reasons for seeking meals away from home. Travelers and pilgrims were among the most frequent customers of medieval dining establishments. Roads were long, treacherous, and unpredictable, making it difficult to carry enough food for an entire journey. Inns and monastery guest houses became essential stops, offering meals that were simple yet filling. Bread, cheese, stews, and ale were common fare for travelers seeking a warm meal before continuing their journey. Pilgrims who traveled long distances to religious sites often relied on monasteries, where food was sometimes provided for free or in exchange for a small donation. Merchants and tradesmen also depended on public dining spaces due to the nature of their work. Those who traveled between towns and cities to trade goods had little opportunity to cook for themselves, so they relied on inns, taverns, and market food to sustain them. Even merchants who remained in one place often needed a quick meal during business hours. Many bought their food from cookshops or street vendors, ensuring they could eat without stepping away from their trade for too long. For wealthier merchants, dining in an inn or a more reputable tavern was also an opportunity to network and conduct business in a social setting. For laborers and apprentices, eating out was sometimes a necessity rather than a choice. In crowded medieval cities, Many lower-class workers did not have access to proper cooking facilities. Apprentices, who lived with their masters during their training, were sometimes provided meals as part of their arrangement. However, those who had to fend for themselves sought cheap meals at cookshops, alehouses, and market stalls. Day laborers, such as masons, blacksmiths, and dock workers, often needed a quick, affordable meal during breaks, making pottage, bread, and whatever meat or fish they could afford their usual diet. Medieval soldiers and guards also frequently dined out, especially when stationed away from home. While armies had supply chains, individual soldiers often had to find their own food while off duty. Inns and taverns near garrison towns, castles, and battle sites catered to them, providing hearty meals suited for their physically demanding lifestyle. These establishments also served as social hubs, where soldiers gathered to drink ale and exchange stories after long shifts. The clergy had a mixed relationship with public dining. While monks typically ate within their monasteries, traveling clergy, such as bishops, priests, and scholars, sometimes dined out when their duties required it. Wealthier members of the clergy could afford better meals, and often ate in reputable inns or taverns, while poorer priests relied on monastery guest houses or simple tavern food when traveling between churches or towns. Even the wealthy elite occasionally dined out, though far less frequently than the working class. Nobles and high-status individuals preferred to eat at home, where they could enjoy elaborate feasts prepared by their own kitchens. However, when traveling, they stayed at high-end inns that provided better food and accommodations. Unlike commoners, who had no choice but to share tables with strangers, the wealthy often paid for private dining areas or requested better service. Some nobles visited taverns or urban inns for entertainment, but they were more selective about where they ate, ensuring their meals met their expectations. Eating out in medieval times was not an everyday activity for most people, but rather a solution to necessity. Travelers, workers, and merchants relied on public food establishments for sustenance, while soldiers and clergy dined out when duty required it. Even the wealthy, though less frequent customers, made use of inns and select taverns when away from home. How was food ordered? Ordering food in medieval times was nothing like the structured process diners are familiar with today. There were no printed menus, waiters taking detailed orders, or kitchens preparing customized meals. Instead, what people ate depended largely on availability, the type of establishment, and social status. Meals were often served at set times with limited choices, and customers had to accept what was offered rather than request specific dishes. Unlike modern restaurants, medieval dining establishments did not offer extensive or predictable menus. Most places served whatever food was available that day, determined by the season, local supplies, and the cook's resources. Customers did not order meals in the way people do today. Instead, they would ask what was being served and accept whatever had been prepared. In an inn, guests were typically given a set meal at a fixed time, while cookshops provided a small selection of ready-made foods, such as pies, roasted meats, and soups. In inns and larger taverns, food was often served communally at long tables. Guests did not place individual orders, but instead paid for a seat at the table and ate whatever the innkeeper provided. Meals were brought out in large shared dishes, and diners helped themselves, often using their hands or knives. There was no option to request substitutions or special preparations. Everyone ate the same thing, reinforcing the communal nature of medieval dining. For those who needed quick meals, cookshops and market stalls offered a more flexible option. Customers could walk up to a cookshop, ask what was available, and choose from the prepared dishes. This system was somewhat similar to modern fast food, where meals were already cooked and ready to be sold. Unlike in inns, where people dined on site, food from cookshops was often taken away to be eaten elsewhere. This made them a practical solution for workers, travelers, and merchants who needed a meal on the go. While most people had little say in what they ate, the wealthy and noble classes had more control over their meals, even when dining outside their homes. When high-status individuals stayed at an inn, they could sometimes request specific dishes if the kitchen had the ingredients and means to prepare them. Some nobles even traveled with their own cooks, ensuring that their meals met their standards and preferences. For special occasions, such as banquets, celebrations, or feasts in taverns or guild halls, meals were often prearranged. Wealthy patrons, guild members, or traveling groups would negotiate with the innkeeper or tavern owner in advance, deciding what would be served. This was one of the few situations where food selection was planned ahead of time, rather than relying on whatever was available that day. The process of ordering food in medieval times was simple but inflexible. Most people ate whatever was available, with little room for personal preference. Inns and taverns served communal meals. Cook shops provided quick pre-made options, and only the wealthy had the privilege of requesting special dishes. Typical meals served. The meals served in medieval dining establishments varied depending on location, social status, and season. Unlike today, where people can choose from extensive menus, medieval food options were dictated by availability, class distinctions, and religious customs. Despite this, certain staple foods were consistently found across inns, taverns, cook shops, and monastery guest houses. Bread was the foundation of nearly every meal, regardless of social class. The type of bread a person ate was determined by wealth and status. The wealthy had access to fine white bread, known as manchet, which was made from high-quality wheat flour. In contrast, commoners ate coarser, darker bread, usually made from rye or barley, which was heavier and more filling. For many diners, trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as edible plates were a key part of meals, soaking up sauces and stews before being eaten or discarded. Pottage, a thick soup or stew, was another staple meal, particularly among the lower classes. A basic pottage was made from grains, vegetables, and whatever herbs were available, making it affordable and easy to prepare. Those who could afford it added meat, fish, or imported spices, creating a richer and more flavorful dish. Cook shops often sold pottage in large pots, serving it alongside bread or cheese to create a more filling meal. Meat was highly valued in medieval dining, but was not accessible to everyone. The most commonly available meats included pork, beef, mutton, and poultry, but only the wealthy could afford game meats like venison or wild boar. In most inns and taverns, meat was roasted on an open fire, or boiled in stews, with wealthier patrons receiving the best cuts while lower-class diners ate tougher portions. For those who could not afford fresh meat regularly, preserved options such as salted or smoked meats were common. Fish played an essential role in medieval meals, particularly on religious fasting days when meat was forbidden. Coastal towns and riverside markets had access to freshwater fish, such as trout, carp, and pike, while inland areas relied on salted or dried fish like cod and herring. Shellfish, including oysters and mussels, were considered a poor man's food, despite their modern reputation as a delicacy. Many monasteries serve fish regularly, offering simple meals of boiled fish with bread and vegetables. Savory pies were another popular dish, especially in cook shops and taverns. These pies were easy to transport, making them ideal for travelers and laborers. The fillings varied, with common options including pork, beef, onions, and root vegetables. Wealthier patrons enjoyed more elaborate versions with exotic spices and richer fillings. Cheese and dairy products provided a valuable source of protein, particularly for those who could not afford meat. Hard cheeses, which lasted longer without spoiling, were commonly eaten with bread or fruit, while softer cheeses were sometimes used in cooking. Butter and milk were less commonly consumed in public dining settings due to limited storage options and short shelf life. Fruits and vegetables were widely consumed, but were not always the centerpiece of a meal. Common vegetables included onions, leeks, cabbage, and turnips, often cooked into pottage or stews. Fruits such as apples, pears, and plums were eaten fresh when in season or dried for preservation. The wealthy enjoyed imported fruits like figs and dates, often served alongside nuts and honey as a sweet treat. Desserts in medieval times were simple compared to modern expectations. Sweet options included honey cakes, sugared almonds, and dried fruits, but sugar was an expensive luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Most lower-class diners satisfied their sweet cravings with bread dipped in honey or spiced wine. The meals available in medieval dining establishments were shaped by class, availability, and tradition. Bread, pottage, and simple meats formed the backbone of most meals, with fish playing an essential role on fasting days. While wealthier diners had access to more refined and varied dishes, most people ate practical, filling meals designed for sustenance rather than luxury. Drinks that accompanied meals. In medieval times, people rarely drank plain water with their meals. Clean drinking water was not always available, and when it was often considered unsafe due to contamination. As a result, medieval diners relied on fermented, brewed, or boiled beverages, which were safer to consume and sometimes even provided nutritional benefits. The drinks served alongside meals depended on social class, location, and personal preference, with ale, wine, mead, cider, and herbal infusions being the most common choices. Ale was by far the most widely consumed drink in medieval Europe, enjoyed by people across all social classes. Unlike modern beer, medieval ale was brewed without hops, resulting in a smoother, sweeter flavor. Many taverns and inns brewed their own ale, ensuring a constant supply for customers. For everyday drinking, people often consumed small ale, which had a lower alcohol content and was considered safe for children and laborers alike. Stronger ales were served in taverns and inns, especially to travelers and merchants seeking refreshment after a long journey. Beer, which contained hops, became more popular in the later medieval period, particularly in Northern Europe. The addition of hops helped preserve the beer for longer, making it a practical choice for merchants and travelers who needed a drink that could last on long journeys. Taverns that catered to wealthier customers often served higher quality, well-brewed beer, while lower-end establishments provided cheaper, more diluted versions. Wine was a more prestigious drink, commonly associated with wealth and status. While it was readily available in southern Europe, where vineyards flourished, it was more expensive and less common in northern regions. Wealthy nobles and clergy often drank imported red or white wines, sometimes flavored with spices or sweetened with honey. In high-end inns and noble dining halls, guests were sometimes offered mulled wine, a warm spiced drink popular in the colder months. Mead, made from fermented honey and water, was another well-loved beverage, particularly among the upper class and in monastic communities. This drink was often infused with spices, herbs, or fruits, making it rich and flavorful. Although it was not as widely available as ale or wine, it was considered a luxurious and prestigious drink, often served during special occasions and feasts. Cider was a popular drink in regions where apples were abundant, such as England and France. It was widely consumed by both the working class and wealthier individuals, as it provided a refreshing alternative to ale. Some taverns and inns specialized in serving cider, particularly in rural areas, where it was produced locally. Herbal infusions and spiced drinks were commonly consumed by those who preferred non-alcoholic options. Monks and religious figures often drank tisanes, or herbal teas, made from mint, chamomile, or sage, believing them to have medicinal benefits. In noble households, spiced milk or almond milk was sometimes served as a warming drink, especially for those who avoided ale and wine for religious or health reasons. Choice of drink in medieval dining establishments was dictated by availability, status, and personal preference. While ale and beer were the most commonly consumed beverages, wine and mead were reserved for the wealthy. Cider provided a regional alternative, while herbal infusions offered a lighter, non-alcoholic option. Dining setups and seating arrangements. The way people dined in medieval public establishments varied significantly depending on the type of venue, the status of the diners, and the occasion. Unlike modern restaurants, which provide individual tables and personal menus, medieval dining was largely communal, with shared seating and set meal times. Whether in an inn, tavern, monastery guest house, or cookshop, meals were structured but often lively, reflecting both practicality and social hierarchy. Inns and taverns, which catered to travelers, merchants, and townspeople, typically arranged their dining areas with large wooden tables where guests sat together, regardless of whether they knew each other. These establishments did not prioritize privacy. Instead, long wooden benches or stools were placed on either side of the tables, creating a crowded but social dining atmosphere. Guests were expected to share trenchers, thick slices of bread used as plates, or wooden platters. And seating was generally on a first-come, first-served basis. Wealthier travelers could sometimes request a private table in an upscale inn, but such privileges were rare. Taverns encouraged conversation, and meals often became a setting for news, gossip, and business dealings, making them not only places to eat, but also centers of community life. Monastery guest houses, on the other hand, maintained a more disciplined and structured approach to dining. Monasteries often provided food for pilgrims, travelers, and the poor, but meals followed strict religious customs. Guests ate in silence, while monks read scriptures, reinforcing an atmosphere of humility and devotion. Seating was carefully arranged according to status, with monks or high-ranking visitors placed at the head of the table, while others were seated further down. Food was served in a structured manner, often in simple wooden bowls, emphasizing modesty and gratitude over indulgence. Guild halls, which were used by organizations of merchants and craftsmen, provided a different kind of dining experience. These halls were designed for structured feasting, often celebrating successful trade deals or religious festivals. Seating arrangements reflected seniority and importance, with guild leaders or esteemed guests seated at the head of the table, while apprentices and lower-rank members sat further away. Compared to taverns or inns, meals in guild halls were more formal, featuring better dishes and a structured order of courses. These meals were usually pre-planned, ensuring a well-organized and celebratory dining experience. Market cookshops and street stalls provided the least formal dining setups. These spaces were cramped and busy, catering to those looking for a quick and inexpensive meal. Customers often ate standing up or sitting on simple stools near the vendor's stall, as these places lacked proper dining areas. Meals were served in wooden bowls or wrapped in leaves, making them easy to carry and consume while moving through the market. Cookshops inside indoor markets had some basic communal seating, but the atmosphere remained focused on efficiency rather than comfort. Meals in these settings were typically short and functional, rather than social. While most medieval dining was communal, the wealthy elite and high-ranking officials sometimes had access to private dining spaces. High-end inns offered private rooms for nobles, featuring cushioned chairs, tablecloths, and higher-quality utensils. Nobles often dined with their own servants, ensuring they received the best cuts of meat and the finest wine. Unlike the lively, informal atmosphere of taverns, private dining areas were quieter and more refined, reserved for those who could afford luxury even while traveling. Dining setups in medieval restaurants were dictated by social class, location, and the nature of the establishment. Most people ate in communal settings, whether at a long tavern table, a monastery bench, or a crowded cookshop. Seating arrangements reflected both practicality and social status, with nobles and guild leaders receiving better accommodations, while common travelers and laborers shared space with strangers. Serving practices and tableware. The way food was served in medieval public dining establishments was very different from modern restaurant service. Meals were often communal, with shared dishes and limited utensils. The type of tableware used depended on social status, location, and the type of establishment. Unlike today's individual servings and plated meals, food was brought out in large portions, and diners helped themselves. Most meals in medieval inns, taverns, and monastery guest houses followed a communal serving style. Large platters or bowls were placed in the center of the table, allowing diners to take portions for themselves. Individual plates were rare, except among the wealthy elite. Instead, people ate from trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as makeshift plates, or directly from shared wooden bowls. Servants or innkeepers brought out food in stages, starting with bread and pottage, followed by meat or fish, and finishing with cheese or fruit if available. In larger inns and noble dining settings, servants played a key role in food service. It was considered improper for high-status individuals to cut their own meat, so servants were responsible for carving meat and serving it to noble guests. At guild feasts or monastery meals, food distribution was based on rank, ensuring that higher-ranking individuals received the best portions, while others received whatever remained. In taverns, innkeepers or barmaids served ale and wine, usually bringing drinks in wooden mugs or pitchers, ensuring a steady supply of alcohol to keep guests satisfied. Tableware varied greatly depending on the establishment and the diner's status. For commoners, trenchers were the standard dining surface, absorbing the juices of stews and meats. Once the meal was over, these bread plates were either eaten, discarded, or given to the poor. Wooden bowls and platters were commonly used in inns, cookshops, and taverns, particularly for serving stews and pottage. Metal plates and dishes, made of pewter or brass, were reserved for wealthier patrons, reflecting their higher social standing. Eating utensils were limited, with knives and spoons being the most commonly used tools. Forks were not yet widely adopted in medieval Europe, so diners often used their hands to eat. Most people carried their own knives, using them to cut meat, spread butter, or scoop food from communal dishes. Spoons, made from wood or metal, were used for soups and pottage, while drinking vessels varied from wooden or clay mugs for ale and wine to glass or silver goblets for the wealthy. Because medieval dining was often a hands-on experience, hand-washing before and after meals was considered an important practice, especially in noble or religious settings. In monasteries and noble inns, basins and pitchers were placed near the dining area, allowing guests to wash their hands before sitting down to eat. In more refined settings, servants poured water over the hands of noble guests, ensuring cleanliness before the meal. However, in taverns and cookshops, hygiene standards were more relaxed, with many diners simply wiping their hands on tablecloths or their clothing instead. Serving practices in medieval dining establishments were communal, practical, and strongly influenced by social status. Food was brought out in large shared dishes, and trenchers or wooden bowls were the most commonly used tableware. With knives and spoons as the primary utensils, medieval dining relied on hand-washing rituals in wealthier settings, but maintained a more casual approach in everyday taverns and cookshops. Portion sizes and meal pricing. Unlike modern restaurants with fixed menus and standardized portion sizes, medieval dining establishments operated on a more fluid and unpredictable system. The amount of food served depended on availability, establishment type, and social class, while pricing fluctuated based on region, season, and the wealth of the customer. Meals were not neatly categorized into small, medium, or large portions. Instead, what a diner received often depended on their status and ability to pay. In taverns and inns, meals were often hearty and filling, especially for travelers who needed sustenance for long journeys. A typical serving included large trenchers of bread, generous portions of pottage, and a share of roasted or boiled meat. However, not everyone received the same treatment. Those who paid less often received smaller portions or lower quality cuts of meat, while wealthier guests enjoyed better cuts and additional side dishes. Cookshops and market stalls provided a different dining experience, focusing on smaller individual portions. A traveler or laborer looking for a quick meal might purchase a meat pie, a bowl of stew, or roasted meat on a skewer. These meals were affordable and convenient, designed for people who did not have the luxury of sitting down for long meals. Monastery guest houses, which often provided food to pilgrims and travelers, followed a more modest and structured approach. Meals in these establishments were sufficient but not indulgent, consisting mainly of bread, cheese, fish, and simple vegetables. Meat was less common, as many monasteries followed religious fasting traditions that restricted the consumption of animal products. At the other end of the spectrum, guild halls and noble feasts offered an entirely different level of dining. Meals served at guild feasts and noble gatherings were extravagant and plentiful, often featuring multiple courses and fine ingredients. Wealthier individuals received the best portions, while lower-ranked guests at these gatherings ate whatever remained after the higher-status attendees had been served. Portion sizes were not always guaranteed, as food shortages and supply disruptions could impact availability. In times of bad harvests or famine, food became scarcer and more expensive, leading to smaller rations and higher prices for even the most basic meals. Those with less money found themselves struggling to afford regular meals, while the wealthy continued to access high-quality ingredients despite economic hardships. The cost of dining out was equally unpredictable, as pricing was not standardized. Instead, food costs fluctuated based on season, location, and economic conditions. A basic meal of bread, pottage, and small ale at a tavern or cookshop was relatively affordable, costing only a few pence, making it accessible to most townsfolk. Meals designed for merchants and travelers, which included bread, meat, cheese, and a drink, were mid-range in price, often costing a few shillings depending on the quality of the ingredients. Luxury dining, however, was an entirely different affair. High-end inns and guild halls catered to nobles and wealthy patrons, offering imported wines, fine cuts of meat, and multiple-course meals. These elaborate feasts sometimes cost several shillings, or even a gold coin, making them an experience only available to those with money to spare. Several factors influenced the cost of dining out. Location played a major role, with food being cheaper in rural areas and significantly more expensive in cities, where supplies had to be transported over long distances. Seasonal availability also affected prices, as fresh food was harder to find in winter and during years of poor harvests, causing a spike in costs. Even a diner's social status could impact what they paid, with wealthier patrons often being charged higher prices simply because they could afford it, while monks, travelers, and the poor sometimes received food at reduced costs or for free in religious establishments. Portion sizes and meal pricing in medieval dining establishments were influenced by class, availability, and necessity. While taverns and inns served large, filling meals, cookshops and market stalls focused on smaller, single-portion foods. Pricing varied widely, with the wealthy enjoying the best ingredients and portions, while the lower classes made do with whatever they could afford. Dining etiquette and table manners. While modern dining etiquette is often associated with formal settings and strict rules, medieval dining customs were dictated by practicality, social hierarchy, and communal living. Table manners varied depending on social status, location, and the type of establishment, with nobles adhering to more refined etiquette, while common folk in taverns and cookshops followed simpler customs. Despite the differences, meals were still governed by a shared understanding of respect and decorum, ensuring that dining remained both orderly and socially engaging. Seating arrangements were an important aspect of medieval dining etiquette, as they reinforced social hierarchy. In inns and taverns, seating was generally first come, first served, though wealthier guests sometimes secured better spots near the fire or on more comfortable benches. Formal settings, such as guild feasts and noble inns, followed a strict seating arrangement where the most important guests sat at the head of the table, while lower status individuals were placed further down. In monasteries and religious guest houses, seating was arranged with equal discipline, often reflecting spiritual rank or importance. Monks and high-ranking guests were seated closer to the head of the table, while common travelers and the poor occupied the remaining spaces. Beyond seating, handling food properly was an essential aspect of medieval table manners. Since forks were not yet widely used in Europe, most people ate with their hands and personal knives. Diners were expected to keep their left hand clean, as it was considered impolite to eat with both hands, particularly in formal settings. A well-mannered diner used a knife carefully, avoiding gestures that might be seen as aggressive or threatening. Given that many meals were served on communal platters, it was also expected that diners would take a fair portion and not hog the best cuts of meat, ensuring that everyone at the table had their share. One of the most distinctive aspects of medieval dining was the use of trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that served as makeshift plates. These trenchers soaked up the juices from stews and meats, making them both a serving dish and part of the meal itself. Among commoners, trenchers were often eaten at the end of the meal, eliminating waste and ensuring nothing went to waste. In noble settings, however, trenchers were discarded or given to the poor in a practice known as alms for the hungry, reinforcing the medieval tradition of charity and social responsibility. Drinking customs also played a key role in medieval dining etiquette. Since many people shared mugs, goblets, or pitchers, it was considered polite to wipe the rim of a shared drinking vessel before passing it to the next person. In more refined settings, excessive drinking was discouraged, and guests were expected to drink in moderation, particularly at religious feasts or noble gatherings. In contrast, taverns encouraged heavier drinking, making ale and wine an integral part of the lively and often rowdy atmosphere. Toasting was common, and it was considered respectful to acknowledge the host or fellow diners when raising a cup. Because eating was often a hands-on experience, cleanliness played an important role in medieval dining customs. In monasteries and noble households, hand-washing before and after meals was a strict requirement. Basins and pitchers of water were placed near dining areas, allowing guests to wash their hands before sitting down. In high-status settings, servants often poured water over guests' hands, ensuring cleanliness before the meal began. However, in taverns and cookshops, hygiene expectations were much lower. Many diners simply wiped their hands on tablecloths, bread, or even their own clothing, making cleanliness a far less formal affair. Beyond table manners, conversation and behavior at the table were also subject to unspoken rules. Dining was a social experience, but certain behaviors were frowned upon. Loud chewing, slurping, and talking with a full mouth were considered bad manners, even in casual settings. In more formal gatherings, guests were expected to refrain from crude jokes, boasting, or arguing, ensuring that the meal remained enjoyable for everyone. Monastic dining had the strictest rules, often requiring guests to eat in silence while monks read religious texts aloud, reinforcing the spiritual nature of the meal. Medieval dining etiquette was shaped by practicality, social hierarchy, and shared customs. While the nobility followed refined table manners, common folk in inns and taverns adhered to simpler but still respectful practices. Food quality and hygiene. The quality of food in medieval dining establishments varied greatly depending on social status, location, and the type of establishment. While wealthy patrons dining in high-end inns and noble houses had access to well-prepared, high-quality meals. The average tavern or cookshop often served food that was filling but not always fresh. Hygiene standards were inconsistent, with some efforts made to maintain cleanliness, but food contamination and spoilage remained a constant risk. The ingredients used in medieval meals played a major role in determining food quality. Wealthy households, monastery guest houses, and high-end inns had access to fresh produce, recently slaughtered meat, and seasonal vegetables. These establishments often sourced their ingredients from local farms, markets, and monastery gardens, ensuring that the food was of good quality. In contrast, lower-tier taverns and cookshops relied on preserved and aged foods, particularly during winter months when fresh supplies were harder to come by. Many foods were salted, dried, smoked, or pickled to extend their shelf life, sometimes at the expense of taste and nutritional value. The quality of meat varied significantly between social classes. Nobles and wealthier patrons dined on prime cuts of beef, venison, and poultry, while commoners often received tougher cuts, offal, or less desirable meats. Some lower-end taverns were even rumored to serve questionable meats, disguising their poor quality with heavy seasonings and long cooking times. Bread, another dietary staple, also reflected social status. The wealthy ate fine white bread, known as manchet, while the lower classes relied on coarser rye or barley loaves, which were heavier and more filling. Pottage, a thick stew consumed across all classes, also varied in quality. In wealthier establishments, it contained meat, vegetables, and flavorful herbs, while in cheaper taverns, it was often watered down and made with whatever ingredients were available. Hygiene practices in medieval kitchens were rudimentary by modern standards, but certain measures were taken to ensure basic cleanliness. Taverns and cookshops typically had open kitchens, allowing customers to watch their food being prepared over an open flame. While this transparency reassured diners, it also meant that food was exposed to dirt, insects, and rodents. Hand washing before meals was encouraged in some inns and noble establishments, but kitchen staff did not always wash their hands frequently, increasing the risk of cross-contamination. Utensils such as knives and spoons were rarely cleaned to modern sanitary standards, further adding to hygiene concerns. One of the most common ways to prevent food waste was by reusing leftovers. Many dishes, particularly stews and pies, were made from previously cooked ingredients, ensuring that nothing went to waste. While this practice helped stretch food supplies, it also increased the risk of serving spoiled food unknowingly. Meat that had gone bad was sometimes covered in strong spices or heavily stewed to mask the taste, while bread could develop mold, which was either scraped off or ignored. In some cases, moldy bread contained ergot, a toxic fungus that could cause hallucinations and illness. Water contamination was another major concern in medieval dining. Since clean drinking water was not always available, many people preferred to drink ale or wine, which were safer due to the brewing process. However, contaminated water still found its way into soups and pottages, increasing the risk of disease. Food storage areas were also vulnerable to rats, mice, and insects, making spoilage and contamination a persistent challenge for medieval cooks. Despite these risks, some measures were taken to maintain food safety and quality. Many towns enforced basic food regulations, requiring butchers and bakers to follow specific standards. Those caught selling spoiled meat or underweight bread faced fines or public punishment, which helped maintain some level of accountability. Monasteries often had stricter food preparation standards, as meals were prepared under religious supervision, ensuring a certain level of cleanliness. Cooking methods also played a role in food safety. Boiling and roasting food at high temperatures helped kill bacteria, making meals safer to consume. The quality and hygiene of food in medieval dining establishments were highly inconsistent. While nobles and monks often enjoyed fresh, well-prepared meals, commoners eating at taverns and cookshops faced a higher risk of food contamination. Hygiene practices were basic at best, and without modern preservation techniques, people relied on salting, smoking, and heavy seasoning to make food last longer. Entertainment while eating. Dining in the medieval period was not just about consuming food. It was often a social and entertaining experience, particularly in noble and upper-class settings. While commoners in taverns and cookshops ate in a more casual and lively atmosphere, feasts in guild halls, inns, and noble courts frequently included various forms of entertainment to keep guests engaged. The type and quality of entertainment depended largely on social status, occasion, and location. Music was one of the most common forms of entertainment during meals. Wealthy lords, royalty, and guild leaders often hired minstrels, harpists, and flute players to provide background music while they dined. Some minstrels even composed songs about their hosts, praising their wealth and generosity as part of their performance. In lower-class establishments, such as taverns and inns, wandering musicians played for tips or free food, using simple instruments like lutes, drums, and fiddles to entertain the crowd. Unlike the formal performances in noble courts, tavern music was often lively and spontaneous, adding to the boisterous atmosphere. Storytelling and poetry were also popular forms of entertainment, especially in noble courts and feasts. Bards and poets recited epic tales, myths, and humorous anecdotes, captivating audiences with stories of chivalry, romance, and legendary heroes like King Arthur. In more casual settings, tavern storytellers and travelers shared folk tales, news from distant lands, and local gossip, making mealtime a social and informative experience. Jesters and performers were a staple of noble feasts, providing comic relief, acrobatics, and witty wordplay to amuse guests. Court jesters, often dressed in brightly colored costumes, were skilled entertainers who could mock nobility without facing severe punishment, though there were limits to their freedom. In more public settings, such as marketplaces and roadside taverns, street performers entertained diners with jugglers, fire breathers, and tumblers, who performed in exchange for coins or food. Games and gambling were common in taverns and inns, where guests often played dice games, early forms of chess, and backgammon during meals. Some establishments even encouraged drinking games, where patrons challenged each other to tests of endurance, creating an energetic and competitive environment. Religious and theatrical performances were sometimes incorporated into formal or religious feasts. In guild banquets and religious gatherings, short biblical plays or performances about saints and heroic figures were staged, blending education with entertainment. These performances often reinforced moral lessons, aligning with the religious and cultural values of the time. Entertainment while eating played a crucial role in medieval social life, particularly during feasts and large gatherings. While nobles enjoyed elaborate performances, music, and gestures, commoners found joy in simple music, games, and storytelling. Seasonal and religious effects on dining. Medieval dining was shaped by two periods: the changing seasons and religious customs. Food availability fluctuated throughout the year, with harvest cycles and preservation techniques determining what people could eat at different times. Meanwhile, religious beliefs, particularly those dictated by the Catholic Church, imposed strict dietary rules that influenced both the type and quantity of food consumed. As a result, dining habits were far from uniform, with people adjusting their meals based on the time of year, religious observances, and social expectations. Seasonal changes played a major role in medieval diets. Without modern preservation methods like refrigeration, people relied on fresh produce during harvest seasons and stored foods during harsher months. Spring marked a time of renewal, bringing fresh vegetables, herbs, and dairy products after the long, harsh winter. Eggs, milk, and early greens such as lettuce and leeks became more available, but meat remained scarce, as many animals were too young to be slaughtered. By summer, food was at its most abundant, with fruits, vegetables, and grains readily available. Nobles indulged in lavish feasts featuring fresh meats and exotic ingredients, while commoners relied on simple breads, dairy products, and garden produce. Autumn was harvest season, a crucial time for gathering grains, apples, pears, nuts, and root vegetables. This was also when many animals were slaughtered and preserved for the coming winter, ensuring that meat would be available in the colder months. Preservation techniques such as salting, smoking, and drying became essential, as winter brought severe food shortages. With fresh produce scarce, people relied on dried beans, salted meats, and stored grains, making meals repetitive and often bland. Nobles had larger food reserves and access to imported goods, but even they had to ration certain foods to ensure supplies lasted until the next harvest. Religious customs were equally influential in shaping medieval dining. Christianity, particularly Catholicism, dictated strict rules regarding what could be eaten and when, with fasting days, feast days, and dietary restrictions woven into daily life. The Church imposed fasting regulations on many days throughout the year, including Lent, Advent, Fridays, and religious holidays, during which meat was forbidden. On these days, people relied on fish, bread, vegetables, dairy, and eggs. Wealthier individuals could afford fresh or exotic seafood, while the poor made do with salted or dried fish, which was often less appetizing but still met religious requirements. Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, was the most significant fasting period, requiring people to avoid meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs. During this time, substitutions such as almond milk in place of cow's milk became popular, and people relied on spiced bread or nuts to compensate for the loss of richer flavors. These fasting traditions ensured that medieval diets fluctuated not only with the seasons, but also with the demands of religious observance. However, religious customs also provided opportunities for feasting and celebration. Holidays such as Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days were marked by elaborate banquets featuring roasted meats, pies, sweets, and ale, often lasting for hours. These feasts provided a break from the restrictions of fasting periods, allowing people to indulge in richer and more extravagant meals. Monasteries also played a key role in shaping medieval dining culture. Monks followed strict dietary rules, eating at fixed times and often in synonyms, reinforcing a sense of discipline and devotion. Their diets were simple but nutritious, consisting of bread, vegetables, fish, and ale. Many monasteries became centers of food production, known for brewing beer, making cheese, and cultivating herbs, which were then sold in local markets. Hospitality was considered a religious duty, meaning that travelers could often find free or affordable meals at monastery run-ins, making them a vital part of medieval public dining. Dining in medieval times was far from consistent. It shifted with the seasons and adapted to religious customs. While feast days allowed for grand meals and indulgence, fasting periods forced people to adopt simpler, plant-based diets. The availability of food was determined by harvest cycles, and preservation methods dictated what could be eaten during the winter months.
Street food versus restaurant dining.
Medieval food culture offered various ways to eat outside the home, but two major options stood out: street food and restaurant-style dining. While both provided meals for travelers, workers, and townspeople, they differed significantly in cost, quality, variety, and the overall dining experience. Street food was the most accessible and convenient option for those needing a quick meal. Vendors set up their stalls in marketplaces, near churches, town squares, and along busy roads, ensuring a steady flow of customers. These food stalls catered to travelers, merchants, and commoners who couldn't afford to spend time in a tavern or inn. Meals were designed for fast consumption, often served wrapped in bread or on wooden trays to make them easier to eat while standing or walking. Restaurant-style dining, on the other hand, was a more structured experience, requiring patrons to sit and wait for their meals. Taverns, inns, and cookshops provided larger, more elaborate meals, making them popular among wealthy merchants, guild members, and travelers who needed lodging. Unlike street food, which was often simple and portable, meals in these establishments were served in courses, allowing for a more leisurely and social dining experience. The type and quality of food varied between street vendors and restaurant-style establishments. Street food was cheap and practical, offering simple meals made from bread, cheese, meats, or fish. Popular choices included meat pies, roasted nuts, fresh fruit, pottage, a thick stew, and ale. Because street vendors needed to prepare food quickly and in bulk, meals were often pre-cooked and reheated, making them convenient but sometimes lower in quality. Taverns and inns, by contrast, provided more elaborate meals, including stews, roasted meats, fresh-baked bread, and even desserts. Cookshops specialized in freshly prepared dishes, ensuring higher quality food, though some cheaper establishments relied on reheating leftovers from previous days. Inns often served regional specialties, making them known for better ingredients and superior flavors compared to street vendors. Beyond food quality, the social experience also differed between street food and restaurant dining. Eating at a street stall was quick and informal, with people often standing or eating on the go. Vendors loudly advertised their food, creating a lively, bustling atmosphere, where people gathered in groups, chatted, and shared their meals. Restaurant-style dining, particularly in taverns and inns, was a more relaxed experience, with seating provided at long communal tables. Taverns served as social hubs, where patrons could drink, gossip, and enjoy music, while inns catered to travelers needing both food and a place to stay. Meals in these establishments were often longer and more structured, allowing people to rest, network, and enjoy a sense of community. Price was another key difference between street food and restaurant dining. Street food was cheaper and more accessible to the lower classes, with small portions sold at affordable prices. In contrast, dining in taverns and inns was more expensive, particularly in reputable establishments known for their high-quality meals and service. Meals were priced higher due to the inclusion of better ingredients, table service, and seating arrangements, making them a luxury reserved for those with money to spare. Both street food and restaurant-style dining played important roles in medieval society. While street vendors provided affordable quick meals for those on the move, taverns, inns, and cookshops catered to those seeking comfort, variety, and a more social dining experience. The role of servants and workers in dining establishments. Medieval dining establishments, whether taverns, inns, or cookshops, relied on a diverse group of workers to keep operations running smoothly. These workers were responsible for everything from preparing and serving food to cleaning, managing supplies, and handling unruly customers. The size and reputation of an establishment determined the number of staff, with larger inns and high-end taverns requiring more specialized workers to maintain high standards of service. At the heart of any dining establishment was the kitchen staff, led by the head cook, often referred to as the master cook. This individual oversaw all aspects of meal preparation, ensuring that food was properly seasoned, cooked to the right texture, and presented well before reaching the guests. In wealthier inns and taverns, the master cook had apprentices and assistants who helped with chopping vegetables, grinding spices, stirring pots, and maintaining the fire. Some of these assistants were responsible for plucking poultry, gutting fish, or preparing dough, ensuring that ingredients were always ready for cooking. Bakers and brewers played a crucial role in some establishments, particularly taverns that produced their own bread and ale, as these staples were essential for daily meals. Once the food was ready, it was the job of the servers and waitstaff to deliver to customers. Tavern wenches and serving boys had to be quick and efficient, especially in crowded taverns where customers demanded fast service. They often had to navigate between rowdy patrons, carefully balancing trays of ale and food while avoiding spills. In higher-end inns, specialized servants known as carvers and cupbearers handled more refined tasks, such as cutting meat for wealthy diners and pouring drinks with elegance. These roles required training in presentation and etiquette, making them prestigious positions compared to general serving jobs. Keeping the establishment clean was another essential task, handled by scullery maids and dishwashers. These workers scrubbed plates, mugs, and cooking tools, often using harsh cleaning methods to remove grease and residue from wooden and metal dishes. They were also responsible for sweeping floors, wiping down tables, and maintaining kitchen hygiene, ensuring that the dining area remained presentable. In inns that provided lodging for travelers, stable hands took care of customers' horses, feeding them, and ensuring they were safely sheltered for the night. Running a successful dining establishment required more than just food and service. It also required strong management and security. The innkeeper or tavern keeper managed finances, supplies, and overall business operations, ensuring that the establishment remained profitable. In smaller inns, the owner might also help in the kitchen or serve customers, but in larger businesses, they focused on managing inventory and overseeing staff. Given the sometimes unruly nature of taverns, bouncers or guards were often employed to handle fights, prevent theft, and ensure customers paid their bills. These workers played a critical role in keeping order, especially in places where alcohol was served in large quantities. Medieval dining establishments relied on a well-organized team of workers, each playing a vital role in ensuring that guests were fed, entertained, and kept safe. From kitchen staff and servers to cleaners and guards, the efficiency of these workers determined whether an inn, tavern, or cookshop thrived or failed. The evolution of medieval dining spaces. Dining spaces in medieval times reflected the social hierarchy, cultural influences, and architectural advancements of the era. From the simple wooden benches of roadside taverns to the grand banquet halls of castles, these spaces evolved to accommodate changing social structures and the growing need for organization and comfort. Over time, medieval dining areas became more structured and specialized, shaping the way people gathered for meals. In the early Middle Ages, dining was a functional and communal activity, with little concern for privacy or refinement. Commoners and travelers ate in open-air markets, cookshops, and rustic taverns, often standing or sitting on simple wooden benches. Seating was limited, and food was served quickly to accommodate a fast-moving crowd. In monasteries, meals were more structured, with monks gathering in refectories, dining halls, where they ate in silence, listening to scripture readings. These meals emphasized discipline and simplicity, with long wooden tables arranged for communal dining. Castles and manor houses, which housed lords, knights, and their households, had their own unique dining customs. The Great Hall was the center of daily life, where everyone from the lord to the lowest servant ate together at long, wooden tables. The seating arrangement was strictly hierarchical. The lord and high-ranking guests sat at the high table on a raised platform, while others occupied lower benches. Meals in these settings were public affairs, reinforcing the social order and the lord's authority over his household. By the 12th and 13th centuries, dining spaces became more organized and structured, reflecting the increasing importance of social divisions. Taverns and inns began offering separate dining areas for wealthier patrons, providing more privacy and comfort than before. These private spaces allowed merchants, travelers, and local elites to enjoy meals without mingling with commoners. Guild halls and merchant houses also established dedicated feasting halls, where members of a trade or profession dined together, strengthening their sense of community and status. Noble estates and castles refined their great halls, incorporating tapestries, chandeliers, and damask and decorative elements to enhance their grandeur. Dining arrangements became even more formalized, with strict seating assignments that reflected social rank. The evolution of these spaces mirrored the growing importance of etiquette and status display, making dining a symbol of power and prestige rather than just a necessity. By the 14th and 15th centuries, medieval dining spaces had become even more specialized and luxurious, particularly for the upper class. Wealthy households and high-end inns introduced private dining chambers, allowing nobles and wealthy travelers to eat in comfort and seclusion. While the Great Hall remained an important space for feasts and gatherings, noble families increasingly preferred smaller, more intimate dining rooms for daily meals. Taverns and inns also evolved to cater to different clientele, with some establishments creating private booths or separate rooms for high-paying customers. Furniture became more refined, with chairs replacing benches for the elite, and tables covered with fine linen instead of bare wood. The shift toward greater comfort and exclusivity reflected a broader societal trend toward structured dining experiences, paving the way for the modern restaurant culture that would emerge in later centuries. Medieval dining spaces underwent a remarkable transformation, moving from simple communal settings to highly structured environments that emphasized hierarchy, privacy, and refinement. While commoners and travelers continued to eat in open, informal settings, wealthier individuals enjoyed private dining rooms and elaborate banquet halls, marking a clear division between social classes and dining customs. Medieval dining was far more complex and varied than many imagine, dictated by social class, location, and cultural traditions. From the bustling street food vendors and noisy taverns to the structured meals of monasteries and the grandeur of castle feasts, the experience of eating out in medieval times was deeply tied to one's place in society. Meals were not just about food, they were social, economic, and even political affairs, influencing everything from business negotiations to religious observances. Dining establishments ranged from humble cookshops, serving the working class, to lavish inns, catering to nobles and wealthy merchants. The types of meals offered were determined by seasonal availability, religious customs, and economic conditions, creating a dining culture that was far from uniform. Etiquette, portion sizes, and food quality varied significantly based on wealth and status, with the wealthy enjoying lavish feasts, while commoners settled for simple, filling meals. Behind every successful dining establishment were the cooks, servers, and tavern workers who ensured that meals were prepared, served, and enjoyed. These workers played a crucial role in the medieval food industry, but their jobs were often demanding and unpredictable. Conflicts over food shortages, pricing, and service were common, sometimes escalating into fights or legal disputes, demonstrating the importance of food as both a necessity and a source of power. As dining spaces evolved, they shifted from large communal halls to more specialized and private rooms, particularly for the upper class. Over time, the emphasis on hierarchy, organization, and comfort became more pronounced, laying the foundation for modern restaurant culture. What began as a practical necessity in taverns and inns gradually developed into a structured and refined experience for the elite, with clear distinctions in service, atmosphere, and expectations.